My name is Kristen Marsh. I'm 38 years old, and I want to tell you about the afternoon I walked into a conference room at my brother's company and watched his expression move through recognition, confusion, and something I can only describe as structural collapse. The specific face of a person whose understanding of a situation has just been revised in a way that cannot be unrevised. He said, "Kristen," I said. "Hello, Daniel." He said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I'm the consultant the FBI sent." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You work in cybersecurity?" I said, "Yes." He said, "For the FBI?" I said, "As a contractor. My primary employer is the federal government." He said, "Which part of the federal government?" I said, "I'm not going to answer that in this context." He said, "Kristen," I said, "Daniel, we can have the personal conversation later. Right now I need to understand the scope of the breach, and I need your IT director in this room in the next 10 minutes. He got his IT director. But I need to start much earlier than that conference room because the story only makes sense if you understand the decade that preceded it. My brother Daniel is 4 years older than me. He is, by any external measure, a successful person. He built a logistics software company from a 2-person startup into a 40-person operation with clients across the southeastern United States. And he did it through a combination of intelligence, stubbornness, and the particular confidence of someone who has been right about enough things to develop an asymmetric relationship with his own certainty. He was not right about me. Our relationship as adults had developed a specific dynamic around the question of my career. Daniel's framework for evaluating professional success was commercial, revenue, growth, market position, the visible markers of a company or a career that is winning by the metrics the business world uses. He was not contemptuous of public service or government work in a general sense. He simply did not find it interesting or impressive in the way that he found commercial success interesting and impressive. I had gone into the Army at 22 as an intelligence officer. Signal intelligence, specifically the domain of intercepted communications, technical collection, and the analytical work that turns raw signals data into actionable intelligence. It was demanding, technically sophisticated work that required a combination of mathematical ability and operational judgment that not many people possessed in the specific form the Army needed. Daniel's response to my career choice was delivered characteristically in a single sentence. He said, "So you're going to guard borders," not a cruel statement, a reductive one. Statement of someone who had formed a picture of military intelligence work from movies and news coverage and the limited contact he had with military culture, and who had decided with the comfortable certainty of a man who is usually right about things in his domain that the picture was accurate. I said, "It's more complicated than that." He said, "I'm sure it is, but you could do this work in the private sector and actually get paid for it." I said, "I'm getting paid for it." He said, "You know what I mean." I knew what he meant. He meant that the compensation structure of military intelligence work did not produce the financial outcomes that his commercial framework would have produced, and that this was evidence of a suboptimal career choice. I did not argue about the compensation structure. I commissioned and spent 4 years in the Army in signals intelligence positions that I cannot describe in full detail, at locations, and for purposes that I am not going to put on paper. What I can say is that the work was serious and the skills I built were specific, and that the combination of formal training, operational experience, and technical exposure I accumulated over those 4 years was the foundation of everything that came after. I transitioned out of the Army at 26 with a top-secret/sensitive compartmented information clearance, a highly specific technical skill set in signals intelligence and network analysis, and the attention of several organizations in the federal intelligence community who were actively recruiting people with exactly my background. I joined the National Security Agency at 26. I am not going to describe in any detail what I do at the NSA. That is not a modesty performance or unnecessary caution. It is the straightforward reality of having signed agreements about what I can and cannot discuss, and those agreements are binding in ways that this story does not change. What I will say is that the work involves the kinds of technical and analytical skills that I had been building since commissioning, applied to problems of significant national security importance, in an environment that is as demanding and as technically sophisticated as anything in the world. The NSA is not a border guarding operation. It is one of the most technically advanced intelligence organizations on the planet. The work I do there is not modest. Daniel did not. Not because I was hiding it in any dramatic sense. I told him I worked for the federal government in an intelligence role, which was true and was all I could say. He knew the general category. He did not know the specific institution, the specific work, or the specific clearance level. His mental model of my career, as far as I could tell from the periodic conversations we had about professional matters, remained approximately the picture he had formed at 22. Kristen works in government intelligence. It is probably important but not commercially interesting. She has made the choice she has made, and that is what it is. He said once at family Christmas, I was 31, he was 35, his company was doing well, and he was in the particular expansive mood of someone whose professional life is generating the outcomes they planned for, he said. You know, Kristen, if you ever decide to come into the private sector, cybersecurity is where the money is. Companies are paying serious money for people who understand this stuff. I said, I know, he said, I mean real money, not government. I said, I know what private sector cybersecurity pays, Daniel. He said, there are firms that would hire you tomorrow. I said, I'm not looking. He said, right, the border guarding. He said it lightly as a callback to the original joke, the way people use old shorthand when they want to acknowledge a disagreement without reopening it. He was not being cruel. He was being imprecise about something he had decided did not require precision. I said something like that. That Christmas was the last time Daniel said anything about my career before the breach. His company was attacked on a Tuesday in March. I don't know the full details of how the attack was executed, because my involvement came after the forensic investigation was already in progress, and the specific technical particulars were reconstructed from evidence that I reviewed rather than witnessed. What I know is that it was a sophisticated intrusion, not a commodity attack using automated tools, but a deliberate targeted operation with the specific goal of extracting a particular category of data that Daniel's company managed on behalf of its clients. The clients whose data was potentially exposed included several companies with federal contracts. This was the detail that changed the category of the incident from a civilian cybersecurity matter into. The FBI's cyber division was notified. The FBI's cyber division, handling a matter that touched on potential exposure of data related to federal contracting, reached out to the relevant federal agencies for technical support. I was assigned to provide that support. I want to be clear that I did not arrange this assignment. I had no way of knowing that the company the FBI needed support on was my brother's. The assignment came through the standard process by which my organization provides support to federal law enforcement on cyber matters, a process that generates assignments based on technical expertise and availability, not on personal connections. If anyone had known that the company in question was owned by my brother, the assignment would have gone to someone else to avoid even the appearance of a conflict. No one knew. I found out when I looked up the company name in the briefing. Daniel's company. I sat with that for approximately 30 seconds. Then I called my supervisor and disclosed the familial connection. My supervisor considered it. He said, is there any reason to think the connection creates a substantive conflict? Do you have financial ties to the company, a stake in the outcome of the investigation? I said, no, he's my brother. I haven't worked for him or invested in him or had any professional relationship with his company. He said, is there a reason to think your objectivity would be compromised? I said, no. If anything, I'd be more thorough, not less. He said, then I don't see a conflict that requires reassignment. Document the disclosure and proceed. I documented the disclosure. I flew to Atlanta. I walked into the conference room. Daniel was there with his IT director, his outside legal counsel, and 2 FBI agents who had been managing the matter before my arrival. He had been briefed that a federal consultant with relevant technical expertise was being brought in. He had not been told who. He saw me. I want to describe his face again because I described it at the beginning and I want to fill in what I abbreviated. There was the recognition, instant, automatic, the face recognition that happens below the level of conscious thought. Then there was the context, the federal badge, the FBI agents I had walked in with, the specific posture of someone who is in the room because the room needs them. Then there was the collision between the recognition and the context, the specific recalibration of a person who has held a fixed picture of someone for 16 years and is encountering that person in a setting that does not fit the picture. He said, Kristen. I said, hello, Daniel. He said, what are you doing here? I said, I'm the consultant the FBI sent. He said, you work in cybersecurity. I said, yes. He said, for the FBI. I said, as a contractor. My primary employer is the federal government. He said, which part? I said, I'm not going to answer that in this context. That sentence, I'm not going to answer that in this context, is the sentence that told him more than any specific answer would have. There are people in the civilian world who work in cybersecurity and cannot name their employer in a business meeting because the employer is a federal intelligence agency. That category of person is specific. Daniel had enough general awareness to understand what category I was indicating. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, okay. He said it in the tone of a man who is updating several things simultaneously and is choosing correctly to prioritize the professional situation over the personal one. He said, what do you need? I said, your IT director and the network logs from the past 90 days. He said, done, we worked. I'm going to describe the work in general terms only because the specific technical details of an active federal cybersecurity investigation are not something I am going to. But the general shape of it matters to the story. The attack had been sophisticated, more sophisticated than the standard criminal ransomware or data theft operations that constitute the majority of corporate cybersecurity incidents. The techniques used, the infrastructure employed, the specific data targeted, all of it pointed toward an actor with significant technical resources and specific intelligence about Daniel's company's internal structure. This was not a Someone had done reconnaissance. Someone had identified Daniel's company as a target worth the effort because of the specific clients it served and the specific data it managed on their behalf. The attack was designed to be quiet, to extract data without triggering the alerts that commodity attacks typically trigger, to complete the operation and exit before the victim noticed anything had happened. They had almost succeeded. The reason they hadn't succeeded was a specific anomaly in the network logs that Daniel's IT director had flagged as potentially suspicious 3 days after the intrusion, which had triggered the internal investigation that had eventually led to the FBI referral. That anomaly, a specific pattern of data movement at a specific time of night, was the kind of thing that a trained analyst in the specific domain I worked in would recognize as meaningful when a general IT professional. The FBI agents managing the case had seen it in the logs but had not been certain what it indicated. I was certain. What it indicated was that the attack was not over. The initial intrusion had established persistence, a technical foothold in Daniel's network that the attackers had maintained even after the visible phase of the attack had completed. They were still there, dormant, waiting for the right moment to continue the operation. I identified the persistence mechanism in the 3rd hour of the first day. I am describing this detail not to be dramatic about the technical work. The technical work is what I do and it is not dramatic to me, but because it is the detail that matters to the full picture of what the next 72 hours look like. And because it is the detail that made the difference between Daniel's company losing its federal contracts and Daniel's company retaining them. If the persistence mechanism had not been found and removed, the attackers would have continued. The data they were after would eventually have been extracted. The federal contracts would have been at risk. The company that Daniel had spent 12 years building might not have survived the consequences. We found it, we removed it. We documented everything in the forensic detail that the FBI needed for the broader investigation into the responsible actor. On the 3rd day, I briefed Daniel and his legal counsel on what we had found, what we had done, and what the remediation requirements were going forward. It was a comprehensive briefing, delivered in the technical but accessible way that I have learned to pitch to non-technical executives who need to understand the substance of a cybersecurity situation without getting lost in the specifics. Daniel listened to the entire briefing without interrupting. When I finished, his legal counsel asked several questions that I answered. His IT director asked several questions that I answered. One of the FBI agents asked a clarifying question that I answered. Then the room was quiet for a moment. Daniel said, "Can I ask you something?" I said yes. He said, "How long have you been doing this?" I said, "The specific kind of work that applies to what happened here, about 12 years. He said, 12 years. I said yes. He said, "Signals intelligence. 4 years. He said, "The border guarding." I said, "Something like that." He said, "It was never border guarding." I said, "No." He said, "I knew it wasn't in some general sense. I just didn't know what it actually was." I said, "You didn't ask." He said, "No, I didn't ask." He said, "Kristen, what you found in those logs on day 1, the persistence mechanism." I said, "Yes." He said, "How did you know what it was?" I said, "I've seen it before. In a different national security context." I said, "I'm not going to answer that question specifically." He said, "Right." He said, "But you've seen it before." I said, "Yes." He said, "And if you hadn't been here." I said, "Your IT director would have found it eventually or not found it and the operation would have continued." He said, "Eventually." I said, "Probably weeks. Maybe longer." He said, "And by then?" I said, "By then the data would have been gone. The federal contract. The company's position with those clients would have been significantly compromised." He was quiet. He said, "Significantly compromised." I said, "That's a conservative description." He looked at his legal counsel, who gave a small nod that confirmed what I had just said. He looked at his IT director, who looked at the table. He looked at me. He said, "You saved my company." I said, "My team and the FBI agents managed the situation." I identified a specific. He said, "Kristen." I said, "Yes." He said, "You saved my company." I said, "Yes, probably." He said, "The border guarding saved my company." I said, "Something like that." He laughed. Not the confident laugh of a man who is right about something, the different laugh of a man who is confronting his own error with enough self-awareness to find it, under the circumstances, genuinely funny. He said, "I owe you an apology." I said, "You owe me a thorough remediation plan and regular security." He said, "I'll do all of that, and I owe you an apology." I said, "I know." He said, "I called it border guarding." I said, "You did." He said, "For 16 years." I said, "Approximately." He said, "While you were doing this." I said, "Among other things." He said, "Other things that you can't tell me about." I said, "Correct." He said, "Are they more impressive than this?" I said, "They're different. I can't evaluate them comparatively in this context." He said, "Of course not." He said, "Kristen, I want to understand something. When I called it border guarding, when I said you should come into the private sector because the money is there, what were you thinking?" I said, "I was thinking that you were applying a commercial framework to a career that doesn't operate within a commercial framework and that the application was producing an inaccurate assessment." He said, "And you didn't correct me." I said, "I tried early on. You weren't revising." He said, "No, I wasn't." He said, "Why didn't you push harder?" I said, "Because you were right that I couldn't tell you what I was actually doing. The specific information that would have corrected your assessment was information I wasn't able to share. So pushing harder would have just produced a more emphatic version of the same impasse." He said, "You couldn't prove it." I said, "I couldn't prove it to you in a way you were allowed to see." He said, "And so you waited." I said, "I did my job. The rest wasn't up to me." He said, "Until the FBI needed a consultant." I said, "Until the FBI needed a consultant." Yes, the conversation in the conference room ended there. There were remediation details to finalize and documentation to complete, and the FBI agents needed to debrief before they departed. The personal conversation moved to the evening, to dinner at a restaurant near Daniel's office, just the two of us. I want to describe that dinner because it matters to the He was uncharacteristically quiet for the first part of the meal, not uncomfortable, processing. The specific focused quiet of someone who has received a significant amount of information in a short period and is organizing it before speaking. He said when we were about halfway through dinner, I have been thinking about what I said at Christmas, 3 years ago, about private sector cybersecurity money. I said, I remember. He said, you said you knew what private sectors. I said, yes. He said, you do know. I said, yes. He said, and you're not tempted. I said, by the money sometime. But money isn't the only variable. He said, what are the other variable? I said, what you work on, who you work with, what it means when you get it right. He said, what does it mean when you get it right? I said, I can't tell you specifically, but it means something. More than the specific situation, which also means something. He said, more than saving money. Considerably more. He was quiet for a moment. He said, I've been building a logistics software company for 12 years. I think it mattered. I think the clients it serves and the operations it improves are real and valuable things. I said they are, he said, but it's a different category from what you're describing. I said, yeah. He said, and I spent 16 years implying that your category was lesser. I said, yes. He said, because the commercial signals were absent. I said, yes. He said, revenue growth, market position. I said, yes. He said, none of which apply to the work you do. I said, no. He said, so I defaulted to the only framework I had and decided the absence of commercial signals meant the absence of significance. I said, yes, that's an accurate description. He said, that was wrong. I said, yes. He said, it was also, I want to say something and I want you to hear it without the professional context, just as your brother. I said, okay. Not just wrong, arrogant. I decided I understood what you were doing without asking you. I decided the framework I had was sufficient to evaluate something I had no direct knowledge of. And I kept making that decision for 16 years because there was nothing available to correct it. I said, until the FBI sent you a consultant. He said, until the FBI sent you. He said, I'm sorry, Kristen, for 16 years of border guarding. I said, I know. He said, no. I mean it as more than an apology for the specific phrase. I mean it as an acknowledgement that I failed consistently to take you seriously in a domain where you were more serious than anyone I have ever worked with in my professional life. I said, that's a significant statement. He said, you found something in 3 hours that my IT director and 2 FBI agents had been looking for 4 days. That is not border guarding. That is, I don't have the right word for it. That's all, he said, expertise that I spent 16 years dismissing. I said, yes. He said, I won't do that again. I said, I know. He said, how can you know? I said, because you're the kind of person who updates when the evidence is sufficient. You just needed evidence that you could see directly. The classified nature of most of my work meant you couldn't see it directly for a long time. He said, and then you walked into my conference room. I said, yes. He said, I said, yes. He said, sent by the FBI. I said, yes. He said, to fix something that would have destroyed everything I built. I said, yes. He said, and that was the evidence I could see directly. I said, yes. He said, that's not a comfortable way to learn something. I said, no, but it's effective. He laughed again, the genuine one. He said, it's very effective. He said, Kristen, I want to ask you something and I need you to be honest. I said, okay. He said, were there other moments before this one? Moments where what you were doing was this significant or more significant? I thought about how to answer honestly within the constraints of what I could say. I said yes. He said many. I said enough. He said, and you couldn't tell me about any of them. I said correct. He said, so for 16 years you were doing work that mattered at a level I couldn't see, and I was calling it border guarding, and there was nothing you could do to correct me because the correction required information you couldn't share. I said yes. He said, that must have been, I don't know what that must have been like. I said, it was familiar. You get used to the gap between what you do and what people outside the work understand about it. He said, that sounds isolating. I said, sometimes. Mostly it's just the shape of the work. He said, do you mind that I didn't know? I said, sometimes, not usually. The work is its own reward in a way that makes external validation less necessary than you might expect. He said, but sometime. I said, but sometimes, yes. He said, like at Christmas 3 years ago. I said, that was a notable one. He said, I'm sorry about Christmas. I said, I know. He paid for dinner. We walked to our cars in the parking lot, and he stood there for a moment in the way that my father stood in auditorium parking lots and my mother stood in hospital hallways, the specific posture of someone who is in the aftermath of something large and is processing it on their feet. He said, are you going to be in Atlanta long? I said, I fly back tomorrow. He said, can we have breakfast? I said, yes. He said, I want to ask you questions about the work. Not the classified parts. I understand you can't talk about those, but the shape of it. What you can tell me. I said, I can tell you some. He said, I want to understand what I was dismissing. I said, okay. He said, better late than never. I said, considerably better. We had breakfast the next morning. I told him what I could tell him, the broad categories, the general nature of the work, the specific skills that the NSA looked for and developed in its analysts, the difference between the signals intelligence work I had done in the Army and the more complex technical work that my current role involved. He asked good questions. He listened to the answers in a way that was different from how he had listened to anything I had said about my career in the preceding 16 years. He said at the end of breakfast, I have a security problem now, a real one. I need to fix the things you identified, I need to build a proper security program, and I need someone to review what I build. I said, your IT director can handle the remediation. For the program build, you should hire a specialized firm. I can give you names. He said, can I call you if I have questions? I said, you can always call me. He said, as your brother? I said, yes. I said, I'm done being the consultant. I'm your sister again. He said, good. He said, Kristen? I said, yes. He said, I called it border guarding. I said, yes. He said, for 16 years. I said, yes. He said, you found a persistence mechanism in 3 hours that was going to destroy my company. I said, yes. He said, and you're still willing to have breakfast with me. I said, you're my brother. He said, I don't deserve the grace. I said, probably not, but it's yours anyway. I am 38 years old. I work for the federal government in a role I cannot fully describe. My brother runs a logistics software company in Atlanta that is, as of the last conversation I had with him, significantly more secure than it was 4 months ago. He calls me once a week. Not about security, he has a firm for that. He calls because we are siblings who are finally and imperfectly having the conversations we should have been having for 16 years. He has not said border guarding since Atlanta. He has said, what are you working on this week? He has said, I was reading about something in the news and I wondered if it was related to your world. He has said, I told my business partner about what you found, not the classified parts, just the shape of it. He asked what agency you work for and I said, I don't know, and he said, how do you not know? And I said, because she can't tell me. And he said, that must be a And I said, yes, it is, and I should have found it more impressive sooner. I am 38 years old. I work in a room that my brother cannot access on problems that he cannot know about. He calls me every week. He calls me his sister. He no longer calls it border guarding. That is enough. That has always been enough. I just needed his company to get hacked for him to see it. Some lessons arrive on their own schedule. Some consultants are sent by the FBI. Some sisters have been waiting 16 years to walk through the right door. I walked through his. That was the whole of it. That was everything.